with the electoral process, completely illegal, wrong, needs to be looked at and
to look at it, it's looking at one particular community and how they voted in that by-election.
But there's a difference between that, isn't there, and Muslim voters deciding reasonably en masse that there are certain parties that represent their interests, and they come to that view as individuals. Ethnic minority communities have always done that.
Something pretty remarkable just happened on live television, and it's the kind of moment politicians absolutely dread. Because in this clip, former Home Secretary Priti Patel finds herself completely cornered as her argument about the recent Gorton and Denton by-election starts to unravel in real time. What begins as a routine political discussion quickly turns into an uncomfortable exchange where some very obvious double standards are laid bare for everyone watching. Now, the controversy here centers around claims from the conservative side about something they're calling a so-called Muslim bloc vote. It's an accusation that suggests certain communities voting around shared concerns is somehow suspicious or improper. But as the conversation unfolds, that argument is about to run into a very inconvenient problem. Because the moment you look at how political parties themselves campaign to specific communities, the logic starts falling apart. And that's exactly where this interview takes an interesting turn. The host begins pressing Patel on the details, asking questions that expose the contradiction at the heart of the claim. Suddenly, what was supposed to be a confident talking point turns into a defensive explanation. And the more the discussion continues, the harder it becomes to square the argument with the reality of how elections actually work. In a democracy, different communities have always voted based on the issues that matter to them. That's been true for decades across countless elections. So when politicians suddenly decide that one specific group doing exactly the same thing is somehow a threat to the system, people start asking questions. And that's where this interview really gets interesting. Before we dive into the full story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's take a look at how this exchange unfolds, because the next part is where the conversation starts getting very uncomfortable.
Of weakness.
Briefly, in other news, domestic news, lots of Labour pain in the Gorton by-election, of course, but isn't the other lesson of that by-election that if you want to oppose this government from the right in seats in urban northern England and similar, that you vote for a party getting 27% of the vote, i.e. Reform, not a minor party status in seats like this, yours, with 2%?
So I think we have to remember that that particular constituency was Labour's sixth most safest seat. You know, we were not contenders in that by-election at all. The real issue about that by-election, the real story, is just the fact that people have lost faith in this government and in Keir Starmer. He's got no authority whatsoever.
No faith in you in their place.
I've made it quite clear to you that is not a Conservative seat where we were in contention. It is Labour's.
You should do better in it.
It was Labour's sixth safest seat. So on that basis alone, it was clear that it was a battle for Labour and Labour's vote, and Labour is a party of the left, and people have chosen to abandon
and if you're
the
on the
Labour
right,
Party.
If you're on the right, which 27% of the people in that constituency are, they turn to Reform and not you.
Well, I don't know how you can describe Reform. I'm not here to be a commentator on Reform.
They're a party of the right, aren't they?
I'm telling you now. Well, they
got lots of your ex-colleagues in for a start.
Well, they voted with Labour on various issues such as welfare and the two-child cap. So I don't think they can.
You don't think they're a party of the right?
They can't associate themselves with the Conservative Party.
They don't want to do that.
So look, the reality is that we were not in contention in that seat, and it was Labour's sixth most safest seat. So this is obviously a crisis in the Labour Party.
Your leader released a statement in the aftermath of that by-election where she described, quote, Labour created the monster of the Muslim community bloc vote. What does she mean by that?
Well, she was pointing out to the sectarian voting that is clearly now taking place.
Why is it sectarian?
But on the basis that it was very much targeted at particular... I mean, if you look at some of the tactics that the Green Party have used and all the rest of it, and the fact now that potentially the Electoral Commission are looking into the voting trends and patterns that took place in that constituency, Lewis, we should be concerned about that.
We should,
we live in a democracy, and that should be looked at. So I don't think we can overlook that issue whatsoever.
No, nor should we. But aren't, Dame Priti, those two quite distinct things? Obviously, if there's been any interference with the electoral process, completely illegal, wrong, needs to be looked at and
to look at it, it's looking at one particular community and how they voted in that by-election.
But there's a difference between that, isn't there, and Muslim voters deciding reasonably en masse that there are certain parties that represent their interests, and they come to that view as individuals. Ethnic minority communities have always done that throughout democratic history. Why is it a problem when Muslims
Well,
do it?
primarily in this particular case, because it's specific to this particular by-election, I think we should just
Camille
recognise
Baynock was
that.
talking about something that happened more historically than that. She's talking about Labour created the monster of the Muslim community.
Because
bloc
of
vote.
course they have recently clearly been playing the Muslim community in terms of securing their own electoral base.
You mean
Their
targeting the
politics-
Muslim community?
Their politics when it comes, look at the politics in their own
But
party.
your party has, for example, targeted British Indian voters in recent elections. Why is that any different?
No, that's a choice for them in terms of how they vote. We're not telling them how to vote.
But that's a choice for Muslims, how they vote.
I think in this by-election it was very particular, and I think now that there are going to be potential investigations
Let me just play
by
this-
the Electoral
this
Commission.
This is a video that to the 2019 election that your then colleague Shailesh Vara put out aimed specifically at British Indian voters.
देश को आज बचाना है, इस देश को आज बचाना है, कुछ करके हमें दिखाना है, तो वोट करो बोरिस जॉनसन, वोट करो बोरिस जॉनसन, ब्रिटेन के पीएम बनेंगे बोरिस जॉनसन, बोरिस जॉनसन.
Conservatives, British Indians. Is that sectarian?
That is part of an election campaign, a national election campaign that all political parties
And that's
do.
what the Green Party were doing, targeting
I'm sure
Muslim voters.
you could have shown the one for the Labour Party that they probably ran in that election,
Sure.
and other
I'm not
political
saying
parties
it's
as well.
improper, but your leader
The
is saying there's
issue
something
here,
improper about
Lewis,
targeting particular
I think
communities.
we should absolutely say in this instance, this could potentially be looked at by the Electoral Commission in terms of voting patterns within the Muslim community. That is something not to be dismissed or taken lightly.
I'm not
and I think
dismissing
on
it.
that basis, until we see further details, which are now being questioned, the Labour Party has clearly been targeting, and we saw that during the last general election against the Gazan independents, and we know that they're incredibly insecure now as a political party, and they have been targeting the Muslim vote through their own national policies, such as
different parties
Palestine
target
two-state
different
solutions.
votes. Historically, the Jewish vote,
It
Indian
has
vote.
changed, Lewis. It has changed. You've seen that. You've seen that since the last general election, and the way the Labour Party in particular have been behaving around Gaza and their own voter base. And I think that was tantamount and paramount in this particular by-election.
One final thing.
Now let's pause for a moment and really unpack what we just watched, because the level of contradiction here is hard to ignore. What we're seeing from parts of the Conservative Party and the hard right is a huge outcry about the idea that the Green Party campaigned on issues that resonate with Muslim voters in the Gorton and Denton by-election. They're presenting it as if something deeply suspicious happened. Almost like communities responding to political messaging is somehow a threat that needs to be investigated. But here's the obvious question that immediately exposes the problem with that argument. How exactly is it considered improper when the Greens speak to concerns that matter to Muslim voters, yet completely normal political strategy when the Conservatives produce campaign material specifically aimed at British Indian voters? Because that didn't happen quietly in the background. We've seen the videos, we've seen the targeted messaging. Political parties across the spectrum regularly speak directly to different communities about issues they care about. That's not some scandal. That's literally how democratic campaigning works. And this is where the double standard becomes impossible to ignore. When one group of voters makes choices based on policies that affect them, it's described as normal democratic participation. But when Muslim voters appear to do exactly the same thing, suddenly the language changes. Now it's framed as something coordinated, suspicious, or even dangerous. That's a very serious accusation to make, and the evidence simply doesn't support it. In fact, when you look at the demographics of Gorton and Denton, the narrative becomes even harder to defend. Around 57% of the population there is white, meaning the majority of the electorate isn't even part of the minority group being blamed for this outcome. So the idea that a small demographic somehow took over the democratic process just doesn't hold up when you actually look at the numbers. And let's not forget something else. If you look at the broader strategy of parties like Reform UK and sections of the Conservative movement, their messaging is often heavily targeted too, whether that's appealing to older voters, wealthy donors, or particular economic groups. That's politics. Parties speak to the voters they think will respond to their message. So the real reason this by-election result is causing so much frustration in some political circles might be far simpler. Voters listened to the options in front of them, and many chose a party they felt was actually paying attention to their concerns. And that's not a crisis for democracy. That's democracy working exactly as it's supposed to. But I want to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure you like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.